My name is Ya-Wen. I teach in the Department of Sociology at Harvard. In terms of social inequality, and usually social scientists use something called Gini coefficient to measure the level of inequality. And in China, now the Gini coefficient has hovered around 0.4, the mid 0.4s. That means China has a relatively high level of social inequality nowadays. Yeah. So there are some major factors that drive the high level of income and also wealth inequality in China. The level of urban and rural inequality is very high in China, and that's related to like hukou institutions, hukou system, and also that's also related to different kinds of developmental model in China. And then the second factor is regional inequality. So in China, usually coastal areas have a higher level of development, economic development, but inner China economic development is not as high as coastal regions. And then the third factor is educational inequality. So usually people who go to colleges can actually have a higher level of income. And then there's also gender inequality. So in fact, China was one of the countries with the lowest level of gender inequalities in the world before the economic reform. But now a woman has been faced with very high degree of discrimination in the labor market. So there is a disparity in terms of wage between women and men. China has been moving toward a more technological driven developmental model. So there has been a process of technology upgrading, but this kind of upgrading has very uneven impacts across different social groups. And so we can think about like two social groups. One group is people who do not go to college, who has like a middle school or high school level of education, and the other group is people who have like higher level of education, who went to college, who has a higher level of skill. And in the process of technological upgrading, a lot of more routine, like low-skill jobs have been replaced by machine, and then that means that people without a better education couldn't really find a good job. And then a lot of jobs in the high-tech sector require higher level of skills and education. So that means that usually people with higher level of education benefit from this kind of technological upgrading process. And then the consequences is that people without a college degree often shuffle between like bad jobs, from one bad job to another bad jobs. For example, nowadays a lot of people are working in the platform sectors, like for example, like delivery workers, and it's very difficult for them to find a better job. So China has been having a demographic crisis. In fact, like 21% of the populations are aged with age 60 over 65 years old. Yeah, so that's 21%. And then in the aging society, that actually requires a lot of like elder care services, and also you need to have very good pension system like health care. But then at the same time, so China also had one-child policy in the past, right? That means that young people today have to take care of, for example, like 2 parents and 4 grandparents. That's a huge burden for young people. And so that's really a very difficult challenge. for young people like today, so they worry about like unaffordable housing prices, and also they have a lot of stress at work, and the labor market is not very strong. So for young people, they have to sacrifice a lot to actually have an okay life. So many young people just decide that it's better for them not to have a child, and then instead they kind of pursue a better life for themselves, and they have to take care of their parents. Yeah. The government has come up with some policy and some incentives, for example, like tax incentive and also cash subsidies and housing subsidies. But then a lot of places in the world have been experimenting these kind of incentive and policies, but there has been very limited effects. Yeah, so we haven't really seen the effect of this policy initiative. Yeah, I think parents and children have different expectations. So parents have to understand that their children actually are living in a very different society compared with themselves. For the older generations, for example, like people who came of age during the reform period, they had really great opportunity. The economy was expanding, and the housing was more affordable. And then the private sector was expanding as well. So they had, many of them experience upward social mobility. But for young people today, the situation is very different. So for the older generation, like they only see that China actually everything has improved over time. But for the younger generation, I think the current generation, maybe Gen Z, is the first generation that really experienced a high level of uncertainty and the end of the reform era. Yeah. So China is such a competitive society. If you want to stand out, then you have to work very hard and then to compete with each other. So since, when Chinese people are young, they already have to begin to compete at school. So there is a high level of anxiety, and also in the workplace, there is an intense like overwork culture, right? I mean, you have to kind of follow those kind of workplace norm. For example, like 996, this kind of like we work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, right? Yeah, but in recent years, we also see some kind of counterculture, right? Some kind of resistance against this kind of competition. And some people, young people, feel it's meaningless to work so much, and they want to enjoy their life, and they are not sure about their future, and they are thinking about what's the meaning of life. Wouldn't really describe. I wouldn't really argue that China has a spiritual vacuum, but I think there is some kind of moral fragmentation, or China has some kind of plural and contested like moral landscape. And despite the Cultural Revolution, I still believe that certain Confucian norms still matter a lot in Chinese culture, in Chinese society. And then has been very strong materialism, consumerism that still exists to some extent, despite the economic slowdown. And there is also like nationalism, the rising nationalism in China. And then there is also a revival of traditional culture, like some people return to Buddhism, Taoism, and folk religion. And there has always been like underground church. So I think the landscape is kind of like fragmented and plural. I think before the mid 2000s, so the economy grew so much, and everyone believed that as long as you work hard, then sooner or later you will be successful, and you will be part of the success, right? The successful stories, and then so people think it's the individual effort is the most important factor that explain success or explain some kind of economic outcome. But nowadays, people realize that there is some kind of structural societal factors that influence whether a person can achieve this outcome. For example, some people, if people who come from like a better of family, they have better social networks, better opportunity, and to go to have better education. So and gradually, people actually understand that. I mean, for people who don't come from a great family, even though you work very hard, it's still possible that you couldn't really achieve prosperity. So in my research, I found that a lot of people, when they feel disillusioned about the society, they try to find individual coping strategy because they don't really see other possibilities. So they can, I mean, they have limited control over the institutions, right? And they can only control their own lifestyle and their relationship with other people. For example, like for young people, they can decide whether they want to get married, whether they want to have a child. So these are things they can decide. But these things, all decisions occur at an individual level, right? But then people they couldn't really influence like institutions. That's very different. So, and I feel that nowadays, compared with China, for example, like 15 years ago, the situation becomes very different. I would say that, for example, like in around 2000, the early 2000, at that time, people had more hope in terms of using some kind of collective action to shape or bring about institutional and also social changes. But I don't really see similar things that have occurred recently.